The early morning sun cast long shadows across Frank Mitchell's perfectly maintained front yard. At 93 years old, the World War II veteran moved slower than he used to, but his daily routine remained as precise as it had been during his military days. Every morning at exactly 6 o'clock, Frank would emerge from his small but well-kept suburban home, wearing his favorite navy blue sweater and carrying an old coffee mug that had seen better days. Today was no different. Frank carefully made his way down the 3 concrete steps of his porch, pausing briefly to admire the morning dew sparkling on his prize-winning roses. These weren't just any roses. Each bush had been planted in memory of a fallen brother from his unit. The garden was his way of keeping their stories alive, a living memorial that brought color and life to the quiet neighborhood. As Frank settled into his favorite wooden chair on the porch, he noticed Tommy, the 10-year-old boy from next door, already waiting by the white picket fence. The boy came almost every morning, eager to hear stories about the war. Frank smiled, remembering how he had been just like Tommy at that age, curious about everything and always ready for a good story. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," Tommy called out, waving enthusiastically. "Can you tell me more about the time you saved your whole unit?" Frank chuckled softly, gesturing for the boy to come sit on the porch steps. "Well, son, I suppose we have time for one story before you head to school." He took a sip of his coffee, his weathered hands wrapped around the warm mug. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of his blooming garden. The old veteran began sharing the tale of a dark night in 1944, when he and his unit found themselves lost behind enemy lines in France. His voice, though aged, still carried the strength of someone who had seen history unfold before his eyes. Tommy listened with rapt attention, his eyes wide with wonder as Frank described how he used his knowledge of the stars to navigate his unit to safety. As the story came to an end, Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street walked by with her grocery bags. She paused, smiling warmly at the pair. "Frank, those roses of yours are looking more beautiful every day," she called out. "Will you be entering them in the county fair again this year?" Frank nodded proudly. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, Maria. These beauties have won blue ribbons 3 years running." He slowly stood up, his joints creaking in protest, and walked to the garden to inspect his beloved flowers more closely. The empty lot next to Frank's house had always been a peaceful extension of his property. He often used it to plant additional flowers, and the neighborhood children would sometimes play there under his watchful eye. The space held a special place in his heart. It was where he and his late wife, Eleanor, used to have picnics in their younger days. As the morning progressed, Frank went about his usual tasks. He carefully watered each rose bush, checked for any signs of pests, and pulled the few stubborn weeds that dared to appear in his immaculate garden. The methodical work brought him peace, each movement a meditation on the simple joys of life. Around noon, Frank heard the distant rumble of motorcycles, a sound that was becoming increasingly common in his usually quiet neighborhood. He didn't think much of it at first. The world was changing, after all, and he had learned to adapt to many changes throughout his long life. Little did Frank know that this ordinary morning would be the last peaceful one he would enjoy for quite some time. The approaching motorcycles would soon disrupt the tranquil life he had carefully built for himself after returning from the war. But for now, he continued his gardening, humming an old military tune under his breath, his weathered hands moving with surprising gentleness among the thorny stems and delicate blooms. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Frank finished his morning routine and headed inside for lunch. He paused at his door, looking back at his garden one last time, the American flag on his porch fluttering gently in the breeze. The old veteran smiled, grateful for another beautiful morning in the life he had fought so hard to protect. The peace of Frank Mitchell's neighborhood changed dramatically one sunny afternoon when 6 motorcycles roared into the empty lot next to his house. The riders, dressed in black leather jackets with skulls emblazoned on the back, jumped off their bikes and started setting up what looked like a temporary hangout spot. Their leader, a tall man with a thick beard and tattooed arms who called himself Razor, noticed Frank watching from his garden. Instead of a friendly wave, Razor gave the old veteran a cold stare that made his intentions clear. They weren't here to make friends. Frank tried to continue with his gardening, but the constant revving of engines and loud laughter made it impossible to focus. The sweet scent of his roses was now mixed with the strong smell of cigarette smoke and exhaust fumes. After an hour of trying to ignore the disruption, Frank decided it was time to have a polite word with his new neighbors. Walking slowly but with purpose, Frank approached the group. His military training was still visible in his straight posture, despite his age. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he said in a clear, friendly voice. "I don't mean to bother you, but would you mind keeping the noise down a bit? The engines are quite loud, and I have trouble hearing my evening programs." Razor looked at his friends and laughed. Well, looks like Grandpa here doesn't appreciate good music." The other bikers joined in the laughter, some of them deliberately revving their engines even louder. "Listen, old-timer," Razor continued, stepping closer to Frank. "This is public property. We can do whatever we want here." Tommy, who was watching from behind Frank's fence, felt scared for his friend. He had never seen anyone treat Mr. Mitchell with such disrespect before. The boy wanted to help but didn't know how. Mrs. Rodriguez, who was tending to her own garden across the street, noticed the confrontation and quickly walked over. "Frank, I need your help with identifying some plants. Would you mind coming over?" she called, trying to give him a reason to walk away from the tense situation. Frank nodded politely to the bikers and turned to leave. As he walked away, one of them mockingly saluted him, causing another round of laughter. The old veteran's face remained calm, but inside, his heart was heavy. He had faced much worse in the war, but this kind of disrespect in his own neighborhood hurt in a different way. Over the next few days, the bikers made the empty lot their regular meeting place. They would arrive in the afternoon, just when Frank usually worked in his garden, and stay until late in the evening. The peaceful sounds of birds and rustling leaves were replaced by the constant roar of engines and loud music. Several neighbors noticed how the situation was affecting Frank. They saw less of him in his garden, and his daily walks became shorter. Even Tommy's morning visits for stories became less frequent as the boy's parents worried about him being near the bikers. One evening, Frank sat in his living room, looking at old photographs from his military days. In one picture, he stood proudly with his unit, all of them young and brave, ready to fight for their country. He thought about how they had faced real dangers together, how they had protected each other. Now, at 93, he felt helpless against a group of troublemakers in his own neighborhood. His grandson, Michael, called that evening to check on him. "Grandpa, why don't you call the police?" he suggested. "What they're doing isn't right." Frank shook his head, even though Michael couldn't see him through the phone. "No, son, I've handled worse situations in my life. Sometimes you have to stand your ground in a different way." As he got ready for bed that night, Frank heard the bikers leaving, their engines purposely revving louder as they passed his house. He stood by his window, watching them disappear down the street. The old veteran's mind was already working on a plan. He might be old, but he hadn't survived a war by giving up when things got tough. Little did the bikers know, Frank Mitchell had faced much bigger challenges in his life, and he wasn't about to let a group of troublemakers destroy the peace he had fought so hard to protect. The situation in Frank's peaceful neighborhood took a dark turn one Monday morning. As he stepped outside for his usual morning routine, he found his garbage cans knocked over, trash scattered across his carefully maintained lawn. This wasn't the work of animals. The cans had been deliberately pushed down, leaving ugly black tire marks on his driveway. Tommy, who had been watching from his house, ran over to help. "Mr. Mitchell, I saw them do it last night," the boy said, his voice shaking with anger. "The bikers drove by really late and kicked over your trash cans. I wanted to come help, but Mom said it wasn't safe to go outside." Frank patted Tommy's shoulder gently. "It's okay, son. You did the right thing by staying inside." Together, they began picking up the scattered trash. Several other neighbors came out to help, but everyone kept looking nervously at the empty lot, knowing the bikers would return later. Mrs. Rodriguez brought over coffee and cookies for everyone helping. "Frank, this has gone too far," she said quietly. "My husband wants to call the police. We're worried it might make things worse. These men, they don't seem like the type to back down easily." Frank smiled at his concerned neighbor. "Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones fought with patience, Maria," he said, though his eyes showed worry as he looked at his trampled flower bed. The roses he had planted for his war buddies were crushed, their petals scattered across the dirt. That afternoon, right on schedule, Razor and his gang arrived. They seemed disappointed to see the yard already cleaned up. One of them, a younger biker with a red bandana, spat on Frank's freshly swept driveway. "Looking good, old-timer," he shouted mockingly. "Maybe we should help you redecorate again tonight." The other bikers laughed. revving their engines so loudly that several neighbors quickly went inside their houses. Frank stood his ground on his porch, watching them with calm eyes that had seen far worse during the war. But inside, his heart ached, not for himself, but for the peace of his neighborhood that these men had destroyed. Later that evening, Frank was watching the evening news when he heard a loud crash outside. Running to his window as quickly as his aged legs would allow, he saw 3 bikers vandalizing his front yard. They had torn down his American flag and were using their motorcycles to tear up his lawn, leaving deep muddy tracks across the grass. The sight of his fallen flag hit Frank hard. That flag had been with him since his retirement ceremony, and he had raised it every morning with the same respect he had shown it during his service. Now it lay in the mud, deliberately dishonored by men who had no understanding of what it represented. Mrs. Rodriguez's husband, Carlos, ran out of his house yelling at the bikers to stop. They just laughed, one of them riding dangerously close to Carlos before speeding away into the night. The message was clear. They weren't afraid of anyone in the neighborhood, and things would only get worse. That night, Frank sat in his favorite chair, holding his dirty and torn flag. His hands, which had once fought for his country, now trembled slightly as he tried to clean the mud off the stars and stripes. On his wall hung photographs of his old unit, brave men who had given their lives for the very freedom these bikers were now abusing. His grandson Michael called again, having heard about the incident from a neighbor. "Grandpa, please, let me call the police," he begged. "This isn't right. You shouldn't have to deal with this." Frank looked at his torn flag again, then at the military medals displayed on his mantle. Among them was the Bronze Star he'd earned for bravery under fire. "No, Michael," he said firmly. "I've been thinking about this. There's someone else I need to call. Sometimes you need to fight fire with fire, but not in the way these boys expect." As he hung up the phone, Frank walked to his desk and opened an old address book. His weathered fingers moved slowly through the pages, stopping at a number he hadn't called in years. Tomorrow would be different, he decided. Tomorrow, he would make a call that would change everything. 3 months later, Frank's garden had undergone an amazing transformation. Where once there had been destruction, now there were new roses blooming more beautifully than ever. But the biggest change wasn't in the garden. It was in the people around it. Every Saturday morning, Razor and his gang would arrive at Frank's house, not with the roar of engines, but with gardening tools and eager attitudes. They had helped replant every rose bush, carefully following Frank's instructions about proper depth and spacing. Tommy would join them, proudly telling the stories of each fallen soldier as they worked. "This one's for Jim Martinez," Tommy would say, pointing to a particularly beautiful red rose. "He saved Mr. Mitchell's life in France." Razor would nod seriously, taking extra care around that bush, understanding now that each flower was a living memorial to a hero. The empty lot next to Frank's house had been transformed too. With permission from the city, obtained through the Veterans Motorcycle Association's connections, it had become a community garden. Veterans and former troublemakers worked side by side, planting vegetables and flowers. Mrs. Rodriguez couldn't believe the change in the neighborhood. "It's like a miracle," she told her husband as they watched Razor helping Frank prune his roses one morning. "Those same boys who caused so much trouble are now the garden's greatest protectors." The younger bikers had changed their appearance too. Their leather jackets now bore patches of respect, American flags and military support symbols. They had learned about honor from the veterans who still visited regularly, and they wore these new patches with genuine pride. Pete from the Veterans Motorcycle Association stopped by often to check on things. One Saturday morning, he found Frank sitting in his usual chair on the porch, surrounded by both young and old bikers, all listening intently as he shared stories from the war. "And that's when we learned," Frank was saying, "that strength isn't about how tough you look or how loud your motorcycle is. It's about standing up for what's right and protecting others who need help." Razor, who now went by his real name, Robert, nodded in agreement. The young man had discovered that his own grandfather had served in Vietnam, and he had started reconnecting with him, learning more about his family's military history. The neighborhood children, led by Tommy, were no longer afraid of the bikers. Instead, they would gather around as both the veterans and the younger riders taught them about motorcycle maintenance, always including lessons about respect and responsibility. Frank's garden had become a regular stop for veteran motorcycle groups passing through town. They would park their bikes carefully, share stories with the younger riders, and pay their respects to the memorial roses. Each visit reinforced the lessons of brotherhood and honor that had transformed the community. 1 year after the confrontation, the neighborhood organized a special ceremony. They installed a small plaque in the community garden, reading, "Dedicated to the veterans who taught us that it's never too late to learn about respect, honor, and true brotherhood." During the ceremony, Frank stood proudly, supported by Razor on one side and Tommy on the other. Looking at the gathered crowd, veterans, reformed troublemakers, neighbors, and children, he saw something more beautiful than any garden. He saw proof that understanding could bridge any divide. "You know what's funny?" Frank said to Tommy later that evening as they watered the roses together. "Those boys thought they were teaching an old man a lesson. Instead, they learned one of life's most important lessons themselves." Tommy smiled, understanding beyond his years. "That's why you didn't call the police, isn't it, Mr. Mitchell? You knew there was a better way." Frank nodded, looking at his thriving garden where veterans and young bikers were still mingling, sharing stories and laughter. The roses stood tall and proud, each one a testament to fallen heroes and newfound respect. The American flag, now properly lit and ceremonially raised each morning by Razor's group, fluttered gently in the evening breeze. Sometimes, Frank said softly, the greatest victories aren't won with fists or force, but with patience, understanding, and the willingness to see the good in people, even when they can't see it in themselves. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. Veterans Motorcycle Association, Pete speaking. Frank's voice was clear and steady as he spoke. "Pete, this is Sergeant Frank Mitchell, 101st Airborne Division, World War II. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "Sergeant Mitchell, the Sergeant Mitchell from the French rescue mission." Pete's voice changed immediately, showing deep respect. "Sir, it's an honor. What can we do for you?" Frank sat in his old leather chair, looking out at his destroyed garden through the window. "Pete, I need the help of my brothers. I got a situation here that requires a different kind of battle strategy." For the next 15 minutes, Frank explained everything: the bikers, the harassment, the destruction of his roses, and the desecration of his flag. As he spoke, he could hear Pete taking notes and occasionally muttering angry comments under his breath. "Those disrespectful punks," Pete growled. "Sir, give me 2 hours, just 2 hours, and I'll make some calls. The Veterans Motorcycle Association has chapters all over the state. Plus, I know some guys from the Marine Corps riders who'd love to help. Nobody, and I mean nobody, treats one of our war heroes like this." While Frank waited, he sat on his porch, watching Razor and his gang arrive at their usual time. They seemed especially pleased with themselves today, pointing and laughing at the destroyed garden. One of them even took pictures of the damage with his phone. Tommy brought Frank a glass of water, sitting quietly beside him. "Are you really not going to call the police, Mr. Mitchell?" the boy asked worriedly. Frank smiled mysteriously. "Sometimes, Tommy, the best way to fight is not with fists or laws, but with brotherhood. Watch and learn, son. Watch and learn." Within an hour, Frank's phone started ringing nonstop. Veterans from 3 different states were calling to offer their support. Many of them had heard his story from their own commanders: how he had saved his entire unit in France, how he had carried a wounded soldier through enemy territory for 2 days to get him medical help. Pete called back, his voice excited. "Sergeant, it's all set. We got over 50 riders coming tomorrow morning. Marines, Army, Navy, Air Force, all veterans, all ready to stand with you. Some of these guys rode with me for years, and let me tell you, they're not people you want to mess with." Frank listened as Pete explained the plan. It was perfect. No violence, no illegal actions, just a show of force and brotherhood that would teach these young troublemakers a lesson they'd never forget. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed Frank's changed mood during dinner, which she had insisted on bringing over. "Frank, you look different," she said, studying his face. "Like you did when you were telling Tommy about your war strategies. What are you planning?" Frank just smiled and patted her hand. "Maria, tomorrow morning, I want you and Carlos to be here at 10 o'clock. Bring Tommy and his parents too. In fact, invite the whole neighborhood. It's time these bikers learned what real brotherhood looks like." That night, Frank took out his old uniform from the closet. It didn't fit anymore, but he carefully pulled out the medals and pins, polishing each one until they shone. He also found his old unit flag, carefully preserved in a setter box. As he prepared for bed, he heard the roar of motorcycles again. Razor's gang was doing their usual late-night drive-by, probably planning more mischief. Frank didn't even flinch at the noise this time. Instead, he smiled, thinking about tomorrow. "Sleep well, boys," he muttered, looking out his window at the retreating bikers. "Tomorrow, you're going to learn what happens when you mess with one of Uncle Sam's soldiers. And more importantly, you're going to learn about respect." In his mind, Frank could already hear the rumble of dozens of motorcycles approaching, bringing with them a force more powerful than any bully's intimidation, the unbreakable bond of veterans who never forget their own. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Frank was up early, dressed in his best shirt with his military pins carefully attached. At exactly 9:30, he heard the first distant rumble of motorcycles, but these weren't the sounds of Razor's gang. From every direction, motorcycles began appearing. These riders were different. Many had American flags mounted on their bikes, and their leather vests displayed military unit patches and veteran status proudly. They moved with discipline, parking their bikes in perfect formation around the empty lot and along the street. Tommy and his family watched in amazement from their front yard as bike after bike arrived. "Mom, look!" Tommy exclaimed. "There must be at least 50 of them." The boy's eyes widened as he saw the military badges and patches on their vests. Pete, the man Frank had called, was among the first to arrive. He was a tall, muscular man in his 50s with graying hair and a Marine Corps tattoo on his arm. He walked straight to Frank and saluted sharply. "Sergeant Mitchell, Marine Corps veteran riders reporting for duty, sir." More veterans approached Frank, each showing their respect. There were former Marines, Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, and Air Force pilots. Many had heard stories of Frank's bravery in World War II, and they shared these tales with the gathering neighbors. Mrs. Rodriguez was handing out coffee and homemade cookies to the veterans, tears in her eyes as she listened to their stories about bravery and sacrifice. The whole neighborhood had come out to watch, standing in their yards or on their porches, waiting to see what would happen next. At 10:30, right on schedule, the familiar sound of Razor's gang approached. The younger bikers came around the corner, their usual arrogant expressions quickly changing to confusion and then concern as they saw the scene before them. The empty lot they had claimed was now filled with rows of gleaming motorcycles, many bigger and more impressive than their own. Veterans stood in disciplined formation, their combat boots and military bearing a sharp contrast to Razor's gang's messy appearance. Pete stepped forward as Razor's group hesitantly approached. "Good morning, boys," he said, his voice calm but carrying the authority of a trained Marine. "We heard you've been having some fun with our friend, Sergeant Mitchell. We thought we'd come by and talk about that." Razor tried to maintain his tough image, but his voice shook slightly. "This is our spot. We hang out here." A tall veteran with a silver star pin on his vest stepped forward. "This spot?" he asked, pointing to Frank's destroyed garden. "You mean where you destroyed the memorial roses of fallen American heroes? Those roses represented men who died protecting the freedoms you take for granted." One by one, veterans began sharing stories about Frank. They told of how he had saved his entire unit in France, carrying a wounded soldier for 2 days through enemy territory. They spoke of his Bronze Star, his Purple Heart, and his lifetime of service to his country. Tommy stood next to Frank, listening with pride as the veterans revealed more about his friend's heroic past. The boy looked at Razor's gang, watching their tough expressions slowly change to ones of shame. "Each rose in that garden," Frank finally spoke, his voice strong and clear, "was planted for a brother who never came home. Men who were younger than you when they gave their lives for this country. They deserve better than what you did to their memory." Razor looked at the destroyed garden, then at the gathered veterans. For the first time, he seemed to understand the magnitude of what he and his gang had done. His shoulders slumped, and he removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that couldn't meet Frank's steady gaze. The contrast was clear to everyone watching. On one side stood decades of honor, sacrifice, and brotherhood, while on the other stood a group of young men who had mistaken bullying for strength. The neighborhood held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The morning sun glinted off the military medals and patches of the gathered veterans, a shining reminder that true strength comes not from intimidation, but from honor, respect, and standing together to protect what's right. Razor shifted uncomfortably as Pete, The Marine Corps veteran pulled out some old photographs. "Take a look at these," Pete said, holding up a black and white picture of young soldiers. "See this man here? That's Sergeant Mitchell in 1944, about your age. He had just carried his wounded friend through enemy territory for 2 days straight." The younger bikers gathered around, their usual toughness replaced by genuine curiosity. In the photo, a young Frank stood tall and proud, his uniform dirty but his eyes determined. It was hard to connect this young soldier with the elderly man they had been tormenting. "Let me tell you what real toughness is," another veteran spoke up. He was a former Navy SEAL with gray hair and kind eyes. "Real toughness isn't destroying an old man's garden or tearing down his flag. Real toughness is what Sergeant Mitchell showed when he ran through enemy fire to save his friends." Tommy had edged closer to listen, and Frank put a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "These men," Frank said, pointing to the roses they had destroyed. Each rose was for one of them. Jim Martinez, who jumped on a grenade to save his unit. David Cohen, who gave his last water to a wounded friend in the desert. Tom Wilson, who sang Christmas songs to keep our spirits up the night before he died. One of Razor's younger gang members removed his bandana, revealing a young face that couldn't hide its shame. "Sir," he said quietly to Frank, "my grandfather was in Vietnam. He never talked about it, but he had a garden too." The morning sun grew warmer as more stories were shared. Veterans told tales of brotherhood, sacrifice, and courage. They spoke of nights in foreign lands where only trust in each other kept them alive. They described the real meaning of strength, not intimidation, but protecting others. Mrs. Rodriguez brought out more coffee and her special homemade cookies. The atmosphere began to change as Razor's gang members found themselves sitting with veterans, listening to stories that made their own attempts at toughness seem childish and empty. "You know what's interesting?" Pete said to Razor, who had been unusually quiet. "Every one of us riders here, we were young and angry once too. But we found something better than fear to build our brotherhood on. We built it on respect, honor, and watching out for each other." Razor looked at his own gang, then at the destroyed garden. For the first time, real emotion showed on his face. We didn't know about the roses," he said, his voice rough. "We didn't know they meant something." "Everything means something to somebody, son," Frank replied gently. "That's why respect isn't just for people you know or understand. It's for everyone who's walked a path you haven't walked yet." A large veteran with a Marine Corps tattoo stepped forward. "So, what are you boys going to do about this?" he asked, gesturing to the ruined garden. His tone wasn't threatening, but it carried the weight of expectation. Razor stood up slowly, looking at his gang members. They nodded, seeming to understand what needed to be done. "Sergeant Mitchell," Razor said, struggling with words he hadn't used in a long time. "We're sorry. We were wrong. If you'll let us, we'd like to help fix what we destroyed." Tommy, who had been watching everything with wide eyes, suddenly spoke up. "I can help too. I know where every rose was planted. Mr. Mitchell told me all their stories." The neighborhood, which had gathered to watch this confrontation, saw something remarkable happening. The line between the two groups of bikers began to blur. Veterans were sharing more stories, showing pictures, and explaining the significance of their patches and pins to the younger riders who now listened with genuine interest. Frank watched it all from his porch, his heart full. This was the kind of victory he had always believed in, not one where enemies were defeated, but where misunderstandings were replaced with understanding and enemies became friends. The next morning dawned gray and cold, matching Frank's heavy heart as he stepped outside to survey the damage from the previous night. What he saw made him stop dead in his tracks. His prized rose garden, the living memorial to his fallen brothers in arms, had been completely destroyed. Every single rose bush had been pulled up by the roots and scattered across the yard. Frank's legs weakened at the sight, and he had to grip his porch railing to steady himself. Each rose bush had represented a friend lost in combat, men who had given their lives so others could live in peace. He had tenderly cared for these roses for decades, speaking to them as if talking to his old friends while he pruned and watered them. Tommy came running over, stopping short when he saw the destruction. "Mr. Mitchell." The boy's voice cracked with emotion. "I heard noises last night. The mom wouldn't let me look outside. I'm so sorry about your roses." The boy's eyes filled with tears as he watched his old friend slowly make his way to the ruined garden. Frank knelt carefully in the dirt, his aged hands picking up a broken rose stem. This particular bush had been planted for Jimmy Martinez, who had saved Frank's life during a fierce battle, sacrificing himself in the process. "Jimmy," Frank whispered, "I'm sorry I couldn't protect your rose." Mrs. Rodriguez hurried over with her husband Carlos, both gasping at the devastation. "Dios mío," Maria whispered, putting her arm around Frank's shoulders. "This is too much, Frank. These men are pure evil to do this to you." Carlos took photos of the damage with his phone, his hands shaking with anger. "I'm calling the police right now, whether you want me to or not, Frank. This is criminal destruction of property." But Frank wasn't listening. His eyes had caught something even worse. His military service flag, the one that had hung proudly by his door for 20 years, lay in shreds on the ground. Next to it was a crude note written in black marker. "Too old to fight back, Grandpa." The message hit Frank harder than any physical blow. In his mind, he was suddenly transported back to 1944, remembering the day his unit had been surrounded by enemy forces. They had been outnumbered then too, but they hadn't given up. They had fought smart, not just hard. Tommy's voice brought him back to the present. "Mr. Mitchell, you're crying," the boy said softly, reaching for the old veteran's hand. Frank touched his cheek, surprised to find it wet. He hadn't cried since Eleanor's funeral 5 years ago. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of determination. The same determination he felt in countless battles, the kind that came before taking decisive action. Standing up straight, Frank looked at his concerned neighbors. "Carlos, thank you, but please don't call the police yet," he said, his voice stronger now. "I need to make a different call first. These boys think I'm too old to fight back. Well, they're about to learn that age has nothing to do with strength." Inside his house, Frank walked to his study with purpose. Opening his desk drawer, he pulled out an old leather-bound journal. Inside was a phone number he hadn't used in years. Before dialing, he looked at the photograph on his wall, his old military unit standing proud in their uniforms, young faces smiling despite the dangers they faced daily. "Watch me, boys," he said to the photograph. "One last mission, for old time's sake." His hands were steady now as he picked up the phone. The number he was about to dial wasn't just any number. It was a direct line to people who understood honor, respect, and the true meaning of brotherhood. People who, like him, had sworn an oath to protect others and had never forgotten that promise. As Frank dialed the number, he smiled for the first time that day. The bikers had made a serious mistake. They thought they were dealing with a helpless old man, but they were about to learn that some bonds never break and some warriors never truly retire.